Okay, well, good morning if you're here in the East Coast, and happy lunchtime if you're in the UK or wherever it is you're in the world. Thank you very much for having me and inviting me into your earphones and screen today. Uh, as Dave just said, my name is Ben Hammersley. I've been working in technology for more than 20 years now. I was the first internet reporter for the Times, and then I wrote a lot of books for O'Reilly and Wiley, mostly about the RSS and RDF standards back in the day. And I'm credited with inventing the word podcast, which is something I have to apologize for on an almost daily basis. But these days, 20 years later, what I mostly do is I work as a futurist. And a futurist is a sort of slightly dubious, I have to admit, term, but my role is to help mostly old white dudes in suits think about the future. My job is to help with large corporations and some governments and some militaries around the world to understand the context within which they will be operating for the next few years. And in many ways, that is a form of sort of science fiction world building. I try to help people create within their minds the context of the places that they will be, spending the rest of their lives, what the world will be like in the next few years. And ordinarily, in usual times, at least the past 20 years, anybody who does this role speaks mostly about technology, because technology has been the driving force behind pretty much every change that we've seen for the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the exponential growth in capability that we get from Moore's law and all of the other equivalent exponential growth laws that go to describe processor speed or network connections or memory or hard drives or whatever, that has all been the driving force behind everything. Now, because of this, because of my particular role, I try to bridge the two worlds, the worlds of extreme high technology and and cutting edge technology stuff, and the worlds of the decision makers, of politicians, of corporate leaders, of generals, and of people who are influential in the world at large, because there is a massive gap between the two. And it's that gap and the risks of that gap that I want to talk about today, because with all of the fantastic sessions of the Data Science Festival and all of the fantastic work that so many of you are doing, you're operating in a world which is considerably further along in its thinking than the people who are running the world have been able to catch up with. And this brings with it some real problems. But those problems themselves are actually very interesting, and that's what I want to address. Specifically, I want to talk about, right at the beginning, the meaning of words. And in two senses, the framing of the whole field, but also the meaning of words in a very technical sense. Now, framing is really everything. When you are communicating what technologies do, when you're trying to explain the implications of new technologies, the way that you frame it, the way that you talk about these things to non-technical people is incredibly important. Now, specifically when we're talking about something like data science or machine learning or AI, the framing is of supreme importance, because this stuff is particularly weird. Now, we all know, I'm sure, the old joke about if it's written in Python, it's machine learning, and if it's written in PowerPoint, it's artificial intelligence. That sort of framing, the sort of quite overselling, the sort of venture capital overselling of this stuff, is one set of misframings. But there are many others, because the technology that we create doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives in a society which is made up of many other things. And we are currently running the risk that the wider society really doesn't understand any of this stuff. And it's that gap between the understanding, the expectations, and the reality that causes a real problem. In political theory, we have a thing called the J-curve theory of civil unrest. And the J-curve theory says that um, civil wars or rebellions or revolutions don't happen because people are oppressed and they don't get what they want. They happen when they start getting what they want, but they get what they want at a rate which is less than what they'd really like. When change isn't quite fast enough for what they were expecting. We kind of have a risk here with a lot of machine learning and data science and artificial intelligence, that the way that the general public understand this stuff is different from what is deliverable. And that difference causes a great deal of tension in society, and a great deal of tension, not just at a societal level, but within our organization, and also perhaps even individually. Let me give you an example of this. I'm sure everybody has seen demonstrations of, or even played with yourself, the GPT-3 natural language model. Now, GPT-3 is incredibly impressive at what it does. It's very impressive, for example, for auto-generation of text. You can look at a lot of those auto-generated texts, and you can read them as if they were written by a person. And in some cases, the examples that you get from GPT-3 or any of the other very, very large models that are coming out today, it gives the impression of there being an intelligence or some form of knowledge there. But of course, there isn't. And the more text that you generate, if you ask it to generate more than one paragraph, for example, you realize that there isn't actually any there in terms of general knowledge or some form of general purpose intelligence. Now, the text generation capabilities of it, the text classification capabilities of it, the sentiment analysis capabilities of it, all the technical aspects of the GPT-3 model are insanely impressive. But that's not really good enough for the general viewer. The number of times I've demonstrated GPT-3 or any other natural language model where I've been trying to explain how impressive it is at what it does, and the viewer who I'm demonstrating it to sort of sits looking incredibly unimpressed because it's not C3PO, because they can't have a conversation with it, because it's obviously not, at the end of the day, a real intelligence at the back end. And that mismatch between the technical impressiveness and the fact that it doesn't replicate science fiction causes tension in decision makers and policy makers and general public intellectuals and so on. And this mismatch, I think, is extremely important to understand. The idea is that AIs, and especially the natural language models, which sort of do a good impression of a human, the idea that they are intelligent, I think, in the human sense, gives rise to a lot of problems. One stems from this, that all of the different types of adversarial effects that you can, adversarial attacks that you can do on natural language processing. If you work in natural language processing, you undoubtedly know about a lot of these attacks. There are many ways that you can confuse an NLP model. You can have syntactic attacks, which is where there's a typo, or a few words are reversed in a sentence, where for a human it still means the same thing, but to the language model it means something completely different. You can have semantic attacks, where you use a synonym for a word, where so for a human it means the same thing, but to the model it means something completely different. You can have metaphorical attacks, where the language makes total sense as a literal sentence, but it is in fact metaphor. And the human reader, the human intelligence, would understand its metaphor, and the same for cultural and mimetic attacks. Now, there are lots and lots of these ways to get an NLP model to produce a human weird result. And you know, we've known about adversarial attacks for a long time. Back in 2013, for example, there was this famous example of an attack on the ImageNet system. So on the left-hand side there, you've got a picture which is obviously a pig. If you then overlay this random noise that faded down a huge amount to 5,000%, and you create the picture on the right, of course, to the human eye, you can't see the difference between the two, but ImageNet classifies one as a pig and the other one as an airliner. And there are many, many examples of this, of adversarial attacks on images. But for NLP models, there are also many other examples. This is an LSTM model that was trained on Rotten Tomatoes' review corpus. And the original text at the top, as you can see, the model predicted it to be a positive result, 77% positive. If you change one single word in the sentence to the one at the bottom, where you change the word film to the word footage, and the same model will say that, will give a sentiment analysis for that text of being radically negative. Now, this is fascinating if you're building any form of textual analysis engine. And of course, these sorts of attacks have been greatly studied, and there are now some very nice libraries that you can use to test your models against these sorts of attacks. There's one called text attack, which is particularly impressive. But this isn't actually a technical problem. This is actually a social problem. Because in real world usage, other people who didn't exist in your training data, look like adversarial input. Any language model which hasn't been trained on a large enough set of training data will treat slang, dialects, even new innovative forms of speech, new words or new phraseology that hadn't been invented before, almost certainly will treat it as if it's an adversarial input. It won't feel it's being attacked, but it will give you a weird result. And this is a real problem, because language models especially, and large machine learning models, are sort of frozen in time at the moment that they are trained. GPT-3, to give a good example, was so expensive and took such a long time to build that it's frozen in time in 2019, which means that it knows nothing about COVID. Now, of course, GPT-3 knows nothing at all anyway. It doesn't have knowledge in that sense, but its corpus didn't have any mention of the word COVID in it. It's stuck in time in that respect. We have to remember that what looks like a technical adversarial attack is actually a social attack. It's actually a social problem, because as we start to deploy these models into the world, they get tested. And they get tested by lots and lots of people who aren't within the training data. Why is it? Now, this, in many respects, is an incredibly obvious point, but it's only incredibly obvious to people who are in the field. And the field now is large enough and influential enough to start to be touching on the rest of the world. And innovation and social change happens interdependently. It's an interdependent co-arising of all of the different things within society. So we have technological change, yes, but we have social and cultural, biological, when we are in a pandemic, mimetic, all of these other things, all these other different layers of human existence that are changing all at the same time. We can introduce new technologies, but all of the rest of the world is introducing other change. And the context that we introduce these new technologies into reacts to itself. So if we introduce technology which appears to everybody else to be miraculous and wizard-like, and then it turns out that that technology isn't miraculous and wizard-like, and in fact acts in a very strange and weird way to the average user, then this produces a societal backlash against that original technology, which is absolutely, completely unfair, because it never was meant to be that thing in the first place. But society perceives something based on its fear of that thing. It's very, very difficult for me to have a meeting or stand on stage in front of a general public audience and not have somebody ask me the question about, do I think the Terminator will come about? It's very difficult to read any article, magazine or newspaper article, or see any television documentary about AI without it showing either clips from the Terminator or some other bit of science fiction where the robots rise up and take over the world. And so, because people fear that as a concept, they take the thing that they fear and they take that the face of that and place it on on this new technology, completely unfairly. But nevertheless, they still do it, which is weird actually, because the really scary stuff isn't the Terminator or the killer robot. The really scary stuff is the banal infrastructure. The really world-changing stuff, the things that should be debated the most, the things that should be questioned the most, are the things which disappear into the background. The things that once they're invented, they become incredibly banal very, very quickly. There are lots of technologies that we use today, which if we got into a time machine and we put them back, say 15 years, they would be seen as insane alien technologies. But today they're entirely commonplace. And it's those technologies which go from amazing to entirely commonplace very, very quickly that are the things that we really need to pay attention to. Not pay attention to in a guarded way, but pay attention to making sure that the rest of the world actually understands what they actually are. This is the mildly risky part of this talk. I haven't shown code of my own on stage for like 17 years. So I'm going to show you a video of an app that I'm in the middle of building, and be nice. This is a functional alpha of a system that I'm building, which is a text editor. And as you can see, it has a regular text editing window at the top there with some text written into it. And if I can get this video to play, you see that I can start typing things into it. And depending as I'm a user, I can't type very well at all. As it depends, I'm a user. At a certain point, I've written a thing, and I want to know more facts about the thing that I'm typing about. And so in this particular demo, as I type extremely slowly, I can go over to the bottom, the window at the bottom, and I can ask the system a question, and it goes away and has a think about it, and then eventually we'll come back with the answer around about now-ish. He says, hoping the video has this bit in it. I'll let that think about it for a second. There you go. Now, the way this works is that I have an NLP model looking at the text that I'm editing, looking at the text that I'm writing in the top window, and I have an NLP model looking at the question that I'm asking. And when I ask the question, it takes the contents of the text window, and it does entity extraction. It finds all of the entities, all of the things in the real world, the people, the places, the concepts, the works of art, the laws, the books, all of the different actual things that are mentioned in the main text. It identifies those things, and I've trained a model that links those entities to their entries in the Wikidata knowledge graph. I then have another system that goes out to that knowledge graph, pulls as much information from that knowledge graph back in, and then it queries that whole corpus, the text that I've written in that box, and all of the stuff brought in from the knowledge graph with a simple Q&A engine, and then sends the answer back. Now, this is a very simple functional alpha, but imagine in a few months' time when this is fast enough and speedy enough and hosted on something with enough GPUs to make it usable. And what you have is an interesting tool for basically anybody writing anything. Imagine that you're back in school and you're writing an essay or whatever. You can be writing the essay, and then you can ask the whole system questions about the subject of that essay. It's effectively a writing companion who is much smarter than you, sitting next to you at your desk. Now that is pretty nifty. And believe me, when you're using it in the real world, it's actually incredibly useful. But the better that system works, the faster it is, the better it is at understanding text, the better it is at bringing back useful answers, the more normalized that sort of thing will be. One can imagine, at least I can hope, that when it's launched and people start using it, it becomes a ubiquitous tool very, very quickly, especially among like high school students, because it'll be incredibly useful. The more people use it, the more normalized it will be. But actually, that sort of thing raises a lot of very, very serious questions. Because you can easily see that a system like that would be something that schools, for example, would want to ban because it's kind of cheating. Yet it isn't, because it's only cheating if you think the world exists in the pre-internet era. But if you acknowledge the fact that as this technology exists, using it can't possibly be considered cheating because it's a thing in the world. And so it starts raising all sorts of interesting moral and ethical and pedagogical and societal debates that are separate from the technology. When I demonstrate this stuff to people who aren't in the technical field, people who don't want to understand the language models and all of the systems, the knowledge graph systems that are used to create it, um, people ask very interesting questions, some of which are very upsettingly not in context of the demonstration. A good example of this is I was demonstrating this a couple of days ago to a friend of mine who's very technologically advanced and really knows enormous amounts about how this works. And her question was, how does it deal with the problem of when I ask it about the British Empire? Now, what we ended up talking about was the decolonization of artificial intelligence. How do we prevent the answers from being sexist? How do we prevent the answers from being racist? How do we prevent the answers from being horribly offensive? And her question was, how do you train the model not to use language which is politically bad in that way? Now, of course, I can't do that because all of that information comes from knowledge graphs published by other people, and way down the line, the information in those knowledge graphs are created by people. And my system is really just a statistical engine doing matrix mathematics to pull that stuff out and turn it into understandable English, understandable by humans. But so it's, in one sense, the question about how do I prevent the system from being racist is completely unfair and totally out of context of the demonstration. But in the other sense, it's a very, very, very valid question. It can be incredibly frustrating to have what is essentially a technical problem or a technical solution being questioned against a social problem. But this really, I think, is our challenge, because as practitioners, we are really the only people, I think, who can have the potential to understand both sides, to bridge the gap between the technical understanding of how something works and the non-technical reaction from the regular person on the street. And whilst that conversation can be incredibly frustrating because they just don't get what you're trying to show them, it's also incredibly important because they, in the other respect, just don't get why you don't understand why their question is important. And so we need to develop as a field a way of explaining not only what it is we do, but also what we are not doing. We have to be able to explain the technical limitations and the social and cultural and semantic limitations of the outputs of our code. Because without being able to do that in a way that is understood by the audience, they will continue to think that these things are magical or sinister. So I think it's incredibly important for us to understand that there is a huge need for the socially skilled specialists, for everybody who's watching this to start to think how they can explain not just what you're making, not just the systems that you're creating and what they can do, but also explain what they can't do, what they don't do, what the implications of the answers are, what the limitations of the knowledge, what the very nature of the knowledge that these things are producing is. Because without clearly defining that to the rest of society, we will continually have weird conversations about whether or not the Terminator will come to pass, or we'll come up against huge social problems caused by the fact that we didn't think about the social implications in the first place. I've gone multi-thought, but let's go for some questions and answers. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, mate. I love a live demo that made you sweat a little tiny bit. It was never in doubt, was it? It was never in doubt. It was always coming. It was always coming. So, mate, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. And it's one of those things that the more you think about it, actually, in terms of the technology becoming ubiquitous, I can't even say the word, and it's part of your daily life, then you know, it has wider effects, doesn't it, on society? And quite often the people behind it are very technical people, and you don't necessarily always, you focus on building a product. You don't always think about the end goal and stuff like that, do you? So I'm going to jump in with, I guess it's a quick question of my own. And I flick between both sides of this. Sometimes I'm very positive and utopian, and technology is going to change the world for the better, and we're all going to end up having better lives. And then part of my brain sometimes goes dystopian, and we're going to lose jobs, and, you know, highly skilled jobs to AI and stuff like that. And then I start to think about social unrest, blah, blah, blah. What's your overall feeling, you know, about the link to technology in the future? Is it, you know, utopian or dystopian, or are we going to be somewhere in the middle? What's your feeling in terms of how it's going to look going forward?
Neither.
Okay.
I think that this need that we seem to have this utopian or dystopian feature, one or the other, is really because of a sense of drama or something like that. That we want to either it's we want everything to be lovely, or we want everything to be shit, but we want us to be the hero of the story, right? And that's really not how the world usually works. What usually happens, what has happened for thousands of years, is that you just have layers on top of stuff. So I do this exercise sometimes with corporate clients. I do this exercise where I take them out onto the street in front of their building, wherever their building is, and I have them point out all of the things that they can see which demonstrate what decade it is. You know, and with the majority of places, unless you're talking about somewhere that's very new, right? Unless you're talking about a brand new development or a city that's incredibly modern, for the majority of places, it's very easy to mentally strip away the 3 or 4 things in your field of view that give away the fact that it's the 2020s. In the majority of the UK, for example, you could stand on any street corner and you could just like blur your vision a little bit, and it could be any year between now and so like 1935.
Yeah. You
just have to get rid of the cars maybe, and like make sure nobody has a phone out. But other than that, really, it could be any time. And what we have is just the continuation of stuff, continuation of society in general, just with additional layers over the top of thin veneers of technology. And the most successful technology disappears. As I said earlier, it becomes banal and disappears into the world and just becomes part of the furniture in a way that's unremarkable. You know, smartphones are a good example of this. We've only had smartphones for what, 12 years? You know, hardly any time at all.
Life before, yeah.
But nobody can really remember that. And certainly if you think of the major websites, for example, if you think of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Amazon, who's all of your favorite? 25 years ago, none of those things existed, and we couldn't have possibly imagined what the world would be like today. And if you said to somebody 25 years ago, in the future, everybody will have supercomputers in their pocket which track their every move, and there will be these things called social networks, and you explained it in that way, it would sound insanely dystopian. Whereas today, it's just kids doing cool dances on TikTok, right? And I think a lot of these AI things are the same. And the reason that there's a dystopian vision to it is because people take that technology and they apply all of their fears to it. They use it as a way of channeling their social anxieties and their political anxieties into a technology, and then saying, well, everything that's wrong with the world is going to be because of AI. All of the inequality, all of the unemployment, all of the social unrest, I think that's due to because of technology, and therefore we're going to file everything to that technology, and then we're going to ban that technology, or we're going to, regulate it in some way, because we're going to use that as the scapegoat. And as technologists, we kind of have to defend our turf, and the way we have to defend our turf is by not allowing them to think that the thing is a miracle in the first place.
Right. Okay.
Right. Yeah. No one wants to ban pocket calculators because they're just pocket calculators. They're not the slippery slope to the Terminator. And lots of all machine learning, especially natural language stuff, is exactly the same thing. It's not the slippery slope to the Terminator at all. There isn't one, and we have to defend that fact. Because if we don't, then people who are using it as a channel for their own cultural, social, political, mimetic, other forms of change, as a channel for those things, will win. Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense, actually. Nice to hear you explain it in that way. There's been a couple of questions come in specifically about your talk, actually. So we'll go to the first one there from John McKeon. I'll ask the very top question. I'll ask both. He does go on to say you partly answered the first question, but it's useful to loop back in, I think, and talk about this. So initially, as you were presenting, John was asking, could a writing companion influence users to particular viewpoints, political and moral? You did start to talk about that, obviously, in the talk. So he said, okay. He's then gone on to re-clarify the question. Okay, you've partly answered that. It sounds like some want the companion to be designed to censor some people's views. How do you see that in terms of the product that you're working on and wider products that are out there?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. I think it's absolutely the case, but it's absolutely the case that any form of aid to thinking or aid to research influences the way you think or what you write about. Your source material, of course, changes your output, right? And so if you're writing an essay about X and you only read source materials A, B, and C, then your piece is probably only going to have viewpoints which express A, B, and C plus your own thinking, right? That's the same for any form of source material pool. So you could say the same thing about libraries, in that the choice of the books in the libraries inherently affects the output of the people who use that library. It's just that this is more convenient or more nifty, or however you want to put it, but it's the same argument. When people raise the question about, is this not some strange form of censorship, or is it not some sort of channel through which people can influence the opinions that other people can have? Well, the answer to that, of course, is yes. Of course it is, in the same way as the choice of textbook that your teacher assigned to you, or the very nature of the questions you're being asked to answer, or the very nature of the syllabus is a choice, and those are human choices.
Yeah.
And those are human choices that are enacted in a human way and just delivered through the technology. And And that's why I think it's important. That's why I think answering this question is very important, or even raising this question before anybody else does and then answering it is very important, because people will look at this and say, ah, that system is making political choices, and that system is trying to influence what I think. And the system isn't doing that. The system is just delivering other material, it's delivering somebody else's source material.
Yeah.
And of course, there are choices that I have to make as a developer as to the sources of that source material, right? The knowledge, which knowledge graphs I use, and so on. But blaming the AI for the text that it delivers is missing the point entirely, but it's absolutely going to happen because the general public think the AI is a sentient thing that has an opinion.
Yeah.
And it's not, right?
How it's been
in
trained.
that way.
Yeah.
And we kind of lack the language. The reason I'm being a bit hesitant about how to say this is because we kind of lack the language to express what that is, to express how to talk about these things, because we talk about intelligence or we talk about opinion as if there's some form of social reasoning happening, whereas of course there's not. What there is though is very clever natural language processing, which is a completely different thing. Yeah. And so you can have a system which is very, very smart, but it's smart in a completely different way to the way that the average person would understand. And so when you say something is very, very smart, they think you mean that it's smart like a smart person and not very sophisticated at analyzing language in a computery way.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's probably a symbol of our times a bit as well, isn't it? Nowadays everyone's very conscious of the sources of information and fake news and all this sort of stuff. But the example that you talked about there, someone picked the school syllabus that you studied as a child. Someone consciously chose that, and that's almost like an echo chamber in itself. But now people are, aware of it and questioning it. So, mate, very, very good points. A question which I'm going to jump to now is there from Mark Peterson. He's actually a very good point, actually, I think. So Mark's saying, going back to your take on using technology in schools, what's your view on allowing or even encouraging pupils to use automated tools, e.g. to solve maths equations? Do you think that if the tools are available, everyone should be able to use it? Or is there still something there in having kids learn the times table and all that sort of stuff? How do you see technology in schools?
So it's interesting. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and she's just started. She's just going to first grade here in the US, and she's just started her mathematics syllabus, which the school she's going to has adopted what's called the Singapore math method or something like that, which is a particular way of teaching math. And it's fascinating to watch that happen, because the way that maths is taught to 6-year-olds now is completely different to the way that it was taught to me when I was 6. And when I was 6, in the same way, it's probably the same as you, like we just sat there and like memorized, times tables and learned maths in that particular way, and did lots and lots and lots of that sort of arithmetic. The way they teach it now, or at least in this particular method, is a much more symbolic way, and it's much more about the structure of numbers, and it's much more about the conceptual understanding of numbers, rather than just rote memorization of, the 7 times table. The reason I raise this is because I think this question of do we allow people to use tools alongside their education is sometimes it's misplaced because we don't understand what's also happening within their education. And I think that modern education techniques where people are taught the conceptual basis of this stuff, and then how to use the tools and how those tools work with that conceptual basis, to me is the much wiser and more interesting thing, than forcing people to learn a subject almost in the order that that subject was discovered, right? The other way of learning maths would be to like start with like early Greek conceptions of geometry and like working your way forward until you get to the Enlightenment, and then you do calculus and you work your way forward, almost like you're teaching a kid to sort of replicate the history of the subject, which is insane compared to knowing everything that we know now, and not only we know now about the subject, but know now about how that subject is used in the real world, and then teaching it in a completely different way. And so I'm fully in favor of teaching everybody how to use the tools that they're going to be using for the rest of their lives, and then teaching the fundamental concepts that those tools are based on underneath. I think that's a much more sensible way of teaching any subject, never mind math. But math is a very particular one because everybody compares the way their kids are taught today with the way that they were taught 30 or 40 years ago.
Basically, I've just given my age away, haven't I? That's what it is.
Right.
I've done nothing else other than tell people I'm old.
It's a very natural thing, and it's a very normal thing, because I was actually talking to the head of maths at my daughter's school, and they said that basically the bane of their lives is sort of angry middle-aged men complaining that their kids aren't learning maths in the way that they learned it before. And this happens every 10 or 20 years with every time there's a new advance in mathematical teaching. You have these people who develop these ways of teaching maths who are experts in pedagogy and experts in human psychology and experts in mathematics, and they have this great experimentally backed, real science-backed way of teaching maths, and they roll it out into the classrooms. And of course, it's difficult because it's maths. And then what's really difficult is the parents lose their shit because you're not teaching it in the way that the parents understand.
Yeah.
And those things are different. So I think we have to be very careful when we have this conversation that we're not confusing two things. One is nostalgia, and the other one is actually the most efficient way of teaching a subject.
Perfect. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. I'm quickly going to mention a comment here from Masiek. He basically is talking about relying on technology and mentions the GPS. Yeah, I'm 100% down with that. Like, there's no way I'm navigating anywhere without a GPS. So we'll definitely not be relying on maps anytime soon. I'm going to skip on to the question then from Sarah. Sarah says, you mentioned that we need to be careful with choosing our words. How do you think we can influence or change the current way that we describe new technologies? Marketeers usually use the word, big buzzwords, smart technology, artificial intelligence, that are now already engraved in society. How do we move away from these words, and what sort of language should we be using?
Yeah, it's super hard, isn't it? I think you should use the technical words, to be honest. I think the idea of, there's something slightly patronizing in some way to think that there needs to be a sort of branding nomenclature, when we could just say, no, this is an artificial intelligence, this is this is an NLP model, or this is whatever it is, right? This is an RNN or something, I think that there are many subjects where we would never do that, when we would never whitewash the technical complexity or the technical subtleties of these things in favor of one overarching and massively inaccurate name, right? Because even in general speech, if you think about things like movie making or economics or politics or science fiction, it's perfectly acceptable to use technical language to precisely define what it is you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Weirdly, I think in this particular case, we kind of get a bit shy about just saying, no, that's not that. It's that's an RNN, in the same way as you can say, no, that's not a movie camera, that's a digital SLR, or that's a 35mm still camera, or that, that's a medium format camera, whatever it is. And people will be cool with that. And the same, people are very adapted to taking on technical language. It's just we don't think it's technical language because we think it's the language of football or the language of cooking or the language of, pop music or something like that. And nobody would ever say, oh, well, we can't ever mention the difference between EDM and death metal, or like between new romantics and folk music.
Yeah.
Although those are very technical, if you think about it, very technical gradations of what's effectively just all music. No, of course not. Like we happily talk about the differences between those two things.
Yeah.
And I think we should give people the benefit of the doubt and just say, no, this is this and this is this, and this has this particular characteristic and this has this particular characteristic. And just as you don't talk about music in general when you're talking about what's good to dance to, we don't talk about machine learning in general when we're talking about X, Y, or Z.
So you think we should trust the people's intelligence? That's a bold.
No, not really, but it's worth a try.
No, I agree. And it's thought provoking as well, because once you started listing those examples with the camera, it's quite a sensible approach, isn't it? You don't just label everything the same, do you? So, mate, thank you for that input. And I'm going to change tack slightly on this, in that I feel like we're very lucky to have you here, and it would be nice to talk a little bit wider about the future and where things are going. A question that's come in from Yasmin, she's asked, how far into the future do you think it is reasonable to try and predict and think about?
Right. Yeah. So this is called the forecast horizon. And when futurism was really a nascent field back in the 60s with the Rand Corporation, which was invented, they were in Santa Monica in California. I used to live basically next door to them, and they were the people who introduced game theory and lots of different forecasting techniques into the US government and the US military. When they were doing futurism, their forecast horizon was 20 years. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany and the invention of the internet, the reunification of Germany and Tim Berners-Lee turning on the first web server are 6 weeks apart, right? Kind of like a pivotal few months of the modern world. We just didn't know it at the time. But after that moment, professional futurists really shrank that forecast horizon right down. And then after 9/11, which, as you remember, is in 2001, and that was just after the first dot-com crash, they shrank it even further. And today, I would say, pre-COVID, we were working on a sort of forecast horizon of about 3 years. Right now, government, military, and major corporations like big petrochemical corporations like Shell, for example, which has a very large futures department, I would say that they're working on a forecastable horizon of about 6 weeks.
Wow, it's crazy.
In terms of planning, we're completely screwed. And this actually is an interesting point. This actually raises the whole thing, which is that we have to, as individuals and societies, we have to change the way that we think about the future. We have to change, because things are changing so fast and so radically. I mean, think back 5 years ago, right? 5 years ago, and 5 years is nothing, right? 5 years ago, we were on track for President Clinton, and Brexit wasn't a thing. And it wasn't a pandemic, right? And right now, this morning, we have an uncontrollable pandemic. No deal Brexit is probably going to happen. And we have Donald Trump as president and attempting a coup, right? If I had written that as a future scenario 5 years ago, my clients would have had me arrested, right? And so because of the impossibility of predicting the future in that way, we actually have to abandon that prediction methodology. I think we have to just say we're never going to be able to predict it, and instead our job is to get ourselves and our teams, our organizations, our families, our communities, whatever, right up to the cutting edge of today. Get ourselves right up to the front end of modernity.
Yeah.
And stay there as much as we can and just position ourselves so that we can adapt in the most appropriate way to whatever change happens. And that ability to adapt competently to whatever happens, regardless of what has happened before, requires also a change in mindset. It requires the ability to let go of things. It requires the ability to do away with nostalgia. It requires the ability to not have things like technical debt. If you're carrying a lot of technical debt, and you'll know this, in your code, but if you think about it at a family or a corporate or a country level, if you're carrying a lot of legacy stuff or technical debt, then that will slow you down or prevent you from being able to adapt to the future. And so I think the future of futurism, if there is a word, if that's a thing, is to abandon long-term planning completely and actually to look backwards a little bit and just get rid of all of the stuff that's holding you back. And once you get rid of all the stuff that's holding you back, you can do whatever you like, and you can adapt quickly to whatever change comes down the line. So I think that the future of thinking about the future is we don't think about the future anymore.
Wow, I'm down
for
myself that. Man, I've done well this week with speakers. I feel like I've had several speakers this week that I'd love to go for a beer with, and I feel like I could sit in a pub all afternoon and talk about everything with you, Ben. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to fire in a couple of final questions, and then we'll sort of draw things to a close. The next question is actually my own question. Well, it's kind of my own, but me and Jess were talking about it, so we'll put this one down as Jess's. It feels like the pace of change is just absolutely crazy at the moment, as you've talked about. On a global scale, what does it look like country to country? Are there countries that are very fast adopting in terms of new technologies, where you see the big breakthroughs coming? Are there countries that are perhaps lagging behind? What does it look like on a global scale?
So I think you have to separate two things. You have to separate the countries where the technologies come from, and the countries where the technologies are used.
Okay.
Because obviously there's a sort of a global hegemony around, American or Chinese companies, or Japanese to a certain extent, companies that are producing the technology, right? So legally speaking, the corporation, the Google or Alphabet or whatever, the Google corporation creates lots of technologies. But I wouldn't say that the US as a country is adapting these technologies as fast as one might imagine. For me, I think the places that are the most impressive in terms of adaptation and in terms of their ability to socially transform based on the technological adaptation would be Estonia, which is so ridiculously advanced in terms of a digital society that they're like 20 years ahead of the UK. And unless you've been to Estonia and you understand what they're doing, what I just said sounds insane, but the Estonian digital society is just another level. I think there are the same sorts of things in terms of adaptive competence, that thing I was talking about before. I think that places like Taiwan and Japan are very good at it, and China specifically, sort of around Shenzhen and Shanghai, a few thousand miles to the north. Again, they are just rolling ahead. This is a dark secret about futurism, and I'm going to let you into it again. I'm going to tell you how to do my job. You can make any prediction about the future you want, and it will be true for 10 million people somewhere on the planet. Yeah. So any concept art that you can find of, like, self self-driving quadcopter air taxis flying between 200-floor skyscrapers that are covered in trees. That sort of, futuristic thing. Well, that is true. That will happen. It's going to happen for 10 million people. And it's going to happen in Dubai. Not going to happen in Stoke-on-Trent.
It's a shame.
Sadly, right. And the same thing for electric scooters, or self-driving taxis, or food delivery robots, or drone post office, or whatever it is. So I'm just going by transportation things off the top of my head. And some of those things will be happening already and are actually incredibly banal and normal and uninteresting now, because they've been around for 5 years somewhere. And in other places, they sound like the unachievable future. And so it's not really countries so much as just areas or more social groups of practice. And so if you want to look for where the real people living in the future are, it's people who spend their lunchtime watching a live video conference from somebody a few thousand miles away talking about machine learning over lunch on their magical piece of black glass that they've got holding their hands, right?
That's it.
We're the future in many, in that way.
Yeah.
It really depends on what you mean. But in terms of as a whole society, dude, Estonia is insane. But it doesn't look like it. It just looks like any other sort of Baltic. It's cold there right now, and it's all medieval in its architecture, but in their infrastructure is incredibly advanced.
Good shout out for Estonia. I love that. I've got one final question for you, Ben. It's coming from Pratiksha. We would like one book recommendation from you. So I'm putting you on the spot by saying one. She asked for multiple, but I'm putting you on the spot. Give us one recommendation for further reading, or a book that you would recommend for people to follow up with.
On this particular subject, righty.
I've really put you on the spot.
I'm tempted to say, in terms of technical books, there's so many, so I'm going to skip out. I think. Do I just one? I would, read the latest William Gibson. Okay. Well, actually, not the latest one because you won't have done it. Read The Peripheral, and then read the second one in that trilogy, Agency, because of their world building and the nature of thinking about society. But if I can be cheeky and throw in a second thing, I would read the most reactionary nonsense that you can find in the Daily Mail. And I would go through it with a red pen, and I would underline everything which is a technical or conceptual error.
Okay.
When it's
a lot of ink.
And then I would think about the fact that that technical and perceptual error isn't actually the fault of the reporter. Speaking as a former technology reporter. It's not the fault of the reporter at all. It's the fault of the field for not being able to explain itself in a way that the reporter can make those sorts of base conceptual mistakes and not be laughed at. Right? If you're a football reporter and you don't understand the basis of football, then you don't remain a football reporter for very long. But you can write about technology in the national press for a very long time without actually understanding the technology at all, because all you have to do is you have to make it sound scary. And we have done a fundamental misservice, I think, over the past few decades in not explaining actually what the stuff is and sort of seeding the ground to scare stories or to misunderstandings of what things actually are. And this has happened in really everything from social media to AI to cybersecurity, to even things like Face ID on your phone and the concept of the one-way hash. You know, if you could literally just explain to people what a one-way hash is, we would actually, you know, there would have been many millions of words fewer written about, you know, things like the privacy implications of Apple knowing your face, which of course it doesn't. But and the same thing for like the wake word, why smart speakers have a particular wake word and how that system actually works. And it's not that there's an always on microphone that's taking everything in the room and giving it to the magical AI at Amazon headquarters that's spying on you and all those sorts of things. If we were just able to explain that no, there's just a singular chip that's just listening for that wake word because it's a neural net that's been trained to do that, and it's not actually listening in the human way, but it's, you know, then an awful lot of those incredibly tiring articles would never have been written, or if they had been written, the people who wrote them would have been shunned from the field in the same way as if you were an economics reporter and you started out an article with the phrase, "Hey guys, there's this thing called money," and that's I think that's a problem. That's a terrible answer to that question. So read the last two William Gibson books.
Perfect. I love it. I love it. Man, I'm going to draw things to a close here. I will try and wrap things up succinctly. We're actually joined by Ben again next Friday. We're having our community film night. We're watching the AlphaGo documentary. We have a very enjoyable panel lined up in which I'm massively unqualified to be on. We have a women's international master joining us. We have the director of Go for the British Society of Go, and then we have Ben and myself. So we'll be doing our best. I feel like, Ben, having seen you today, you're well qualified now.
Dude, no, mate. After you and I met that panel last week, I have been like fanboying myself crazy about the two other panelists. So yeah, everybody should definitely. The documentary is extremely good, very entertaining and very interesting. But the other two panelists are still the best. And
good, eh?
it's gonna be great.
Awesome. Well, for those of you with us today, if you can just stick a little thank you in the chat, that's always nice to do. And we're going to draw things to a close here. So with regards to the Data Science Festival, it's been a fantastic month. It's been great to have you involved, Ben, today, and very much look forward to having you with us next week as well. And I don't think there's any final announcements. I was just letting a few of those thank you come through. It's always nice to see a bit of thanks come through on the chat. So thanks for me, Ben. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks to all of you guys at home, and we'll be back with you shortly. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.